I am very pleased to welcome you all here. I am Emily Molden, the Executive Director of the Nantucket Land Council, and this is one of the events that I look forward to the most of ours every summer. This is our 7th State of the Harbor Forum. We began these forums back in 2017 as an opportunity to bring the community together with the town and local partners who are working on improving the quality of our harbor and helping to balance our use with the needs of our resources. So this year, I'm particularly excited about the topic, which really is all about the health of our eelgrass, both in Nantucket and Madaket harbors, because we began a great relationship with Dr. Alyssa Novak in Boston University back in 2017, 2018, when we embarked on this process of completing a health assessment of Nantucket and Madaket harbors, which then also led us to work with a number of different organizations and partners and funders in an effort to restore a couple of half-acre sites in Nantucket Harbor with eelgrass, which Alyssa will speak about just shortly. So I'm really excited because this is really the first time that this information has been formally presented since it's all been gathered over the last several years. And I want to take a moment to especially thank all of our sponsors this afternoon, for all of their support for this event. And I also want to recognize the Nantucket Land Council Water Fund, which was also established back around 2017 as a donor-restricted fund that is focused and dedicated on the Nantucket Land Council's water-related programs and initiatives. So our research, educational events such as this. The Water Fund supports our Nantucket Waterkeeper program, which is part of the Waterkeeper Alliance, a global organization working for clean water. And it is my pleasure to also announce that, once again, the Nantucket Land Council's board has generously sponsored a challenge grant for 2023, matching gifts up to $75,000 through the end of 2023. So I would encourage everyone to visit our website, participate. You can come see us afterwards. And I especially want to thank our Water Fund Founder Circle members who really helped to establish our Water Fund and get it off the ground. Our Waterkeeper program is a big part of what we do, moving not just from the land use around the island, but to all of our water-related issues as well. And then finally, for tonight's presentation, focusing on this eelgrass research, I want to especially thank all of our funders and partners, as well as an extensive list of volunteers that I couldn't possibly recognize all of, but this has definitely been a group effort, particularly the restoration work, which I think you'll find really interesting. So without further ado, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Alyssa Novak. She is research faculty at Boston University. She works in a variety of both temperate and tropical coastal ecosystems with a focus on seagrass ecology, blue carbon storage, and restoration work. Dr. Novak has published over 90 papers, presentations, and technical reports on seagrasses. She's also won the EPA Merit Award and NOAA Awards for her work with seagrasses. Dr. Novak's also currently the seagrass leader for the International Union for Conservation of Nature. She's been a terrific partner and leader, collaborator with us and the town and the other partners for this work. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alyssa Novak.
Thank you again for having me. So today I'm going to be talking about a health assessment that we conducted here in Nantucket, looking at the eelgrass populations and then also our restoration efforts. Before I begin, I want to get everybody up to date on what eelgrass is, so everybody's on the same page, in case you aren't familiar with the species. Eelgrass is a marine angiosperm, which means it's a flowering plant. It's actually not a true grass. It is most closely related to lily and corn. There are 72 species of seagrass, and this is the dominant species that you find here in the northern hemisphere. And it grows submerged from the intertidal zone all the way up to about 20 meters in depth. Eelgrass forms extensive beds or meadows. They range in size anywhere from a quarter of an acre up to hundreds of acres. And they can be monospecific with one species, or they can be mixed with multiple species. A lot of people ask me what the difference is between seagrass and algae. Seagrass, as I mentioned, they have flowers, so when they're reproducing, you see flowers on them. But they also have a vascular system, which you don't get in algae. So the vascular system is used to transport nutrients as well as oxygen, and you see this in their leaves as well as their roots and rhizomes. In algae, they only have a stipe and a holdfast to anchor them into the ground, whereas in the seagrasses, they have that strong rhizome that you'll see when you pull it out of the ground, as well as those roots. A lot of people also don't know the value of eelgrass meadows. They play a very important role in our coastal ecosystems. They help to stabilize sediments. They do this with their roots and rhizomes, and this prevents sediment from moving into channels. They also help to attenuate wave energy. And so during a storm, they can reduce wave energy by about 50%, which helps with protecting the coastline and prevents erosion. They also help to trap and cycle nutrients, and they do this by uptaking nutrients from the water column. And this helps to improve water quality as well as clarity. Eelgrass is also considered a canary in the coal mine for the oceans. It's used as a health indicator. So if you just see a decline in eelgrass in your harbor, you can assume that there's an issue with water quality. They also store a significant amount of carbon. So eelgrass meadows store twice as much carbon per unit area as terrestrial forests. And all this carbon is stored below ground in sediments. And this can stay in the sediments for thousands of years. And so as you can imagine, this is helping to mitigate for climate change. So if you start to lose those eelgrass beds, all of that carbon's going back into the atmosphere. And then lastly, most people know that eelgrass provides food and habitat to a number of different organisms. Some of those are commercially important and some of those are endangered. So eelgrass is declining through most of its range. Here in Massachusetts, we've lost over 47% since 1994. And Nantucket has lost about 34%. So back in 1994, we had about 14,000 hectares, and in 2017, we had approximately 9,000 hectares. Nantucket Harbor has experienced a 30% loss, and Madaket Harbor has experienced a 24% loss. Tuckernuck has been fairly stable. In fact, it's increasing by about 1%. We didn't know what factors were contributing to eelgrass losses in Nantucket. There was some concern that nutrients were an issue, but to determine if there were other stressors, including nutrients, we decided to conduct a health assessment. So between 2017 and 2020, we went out to multiple sites in Nantucket Harbor as well as Madaket Harbor. We also went out to sites on Tuckernuck and Muskeget. And what we did at each one of these sites is we collected information on eelgrass characteristics. So we went out, we collected shoots, and we looked at their morphology. We looked at the number of leaves on each shoot. We looked at leaf width. We looked at above ground weight and below ground weight. We also looked at growth rates. And then we collected information on meadow structure. So we looked at shoot density, percent cover, and canopy height. And we looked at nutrient content in leaves. We wanted to see how much nitrogen the plants were taking up, and we also wanted to identify the sources of nitrogen. We also went out and we collected sediment cores, and we looked at sediment characteristics. We looked at grain size. We looked at sedimentation rates to see whether or not the beds are keeping up with sea level rise. And we quantified carbon and nitrogen in our cores and looked at stable isotopes. And then lastly, at multiple sites in Nantucket Harbor and Madaket Harbor, we put out sensors and we looked at light levels in the beds, and we also looked at temperature because we wanted to see whether or not the plants were getting adequate light and they were in conditions that were not stressful for them. So I apologize here, but I have to show you some data. So I'll walk you through it. So In Nantucket Harbor, as well as Madaket Harbor, we found when looking at our morphology results, the plants were significantly smaller than the plants found on Tuckernuck or Muskeget. We saw this at all sites except one. The only site where plants were the same size as the plants out on Tuckernuck and Muskeget was a site we called MH6, and that was in the center of Madaket Harbor, and that area is extremely well flushed. So plants being small is not a good thing. It's indicative of stress. When we looked at, this is another slide. When we looked at our nutrient levels, we found that at all sites in Nantucket Harbor as well as Madaket Harbor, nutrient conditions were comparable, if not higher, than other systems that are considered eutrophied, which means they have high nitrogen loadings. Examples of those sites would be Barnegat Bay, Wequoit Bay, and Great Bay in New Hampshire. And then here's the interesting results. When we started looking at stable isotopes and identifying the sources of nitrogen, we found that in Nantucket Harbor, plants are taking up nitrogen from fertilizer as well as atmospheric deposition. In Madaket Harbor, they're taking up nitrogen from fertilizer, atmospheric deposition, as well as sewage. Tuckernuck, they're just taking up atmospheric deposition, so they're getting their nitrogen just from the atmosphere like you should be. And you would expect that because Tuckernuck is not developed. And then on Muskeget, they're taking up their nitrogen from sewage. It's actually from the seal population out there. So this was a nice comparative analysis for everybody. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if you have the seals there. Sediment characteristics. So this is a lot of information on this slide. What I wanted to point out is that your eelgrass beds here are actually storing a lot of carbon, which is good, but as I mentioned, as they begin to decline, that carbon is going back out into the atmosphere, and so that's not necessarily a good thing. And the other thing that's a concern is that the beds are not keeping up with sea level rise. So sea level rise here on Nantucket is about 3.9 millimeters per year, and there's only one bed in Madaket Harbor. It's at 4 millimeters per year. The rest are significantly lower. So that's not a good thing because that's limiting the light available to them through time. When we looked at our light sensors, we found that eelgrass is not receiving enough light during its peak growing season. So eelgrass needs about 58% surface irradiance to reach the canopy in order for it to grow and expand. At about 34%, it becomes light limited, which means that it's not getting enough light to photosynthesize. And then around 14%, it begins to decline. So if you look at the graph on the right and the left, you will see that in Nantucket Harbor and Madaket Harbor, in May, they are getting between 40 and 50% surface irradiance. So they're getting enough to maintain their carbon balance. However, as you start moving into June, July, and August, you see that these values significantly decline. And so the plants are just barely holding on. And the reasons for this are pretty evident. So if you go into Nantucket Harbor as well as Madaket Harbor, you can see the eelgrass beds are smothered with algae. But if you go out to Tuckernuck and Muskeget, you don't see any algae out there at all. So what's happening in Nantucket Harbor as well as Madaket Harbor? Both harbors are in a stage of cultural eutrophication. So in general, eelgrass is considered nutrient limited. So if you start adding nitrogen into the system, the plants begin to grow, which is good. However, as you continue to increase that nitrogen, you start getting other plants to grow as well. And so you start getting epiphytes on the outside of the plants, and that reduces light levels. And then eventually you start getting macroalgae growing, which is what we have going on here. And the macroalgae end up smothering the plants. And eventually you end up with a system that no longer has any seagrass in it. And it's only dominated by phytoplankton. And on this picture right here on the right is showing you an extremely eutrophic system. It's not Nantucket, but we're heading that way. When we started looking at the temperature results, the temperature data was also very concerning. We found that eelgrass is thermally stressed during its peak growing season too. So if you look at the data starting in June, you see that temperatures are below 25 degrees Celsius. Once you start hitting 25 degrees Celsius, the plants stop photosynthesizing again, they start respiring. And then once you hit about 28 degrees Celsius, they end up dying. They can't survive those temperatures whatsoever. So once you start hitting July and August, you can see in both systems, we have many days where temperatures are well above 25 degrees Celsius and they even hit 28 degrees Celsius. We looked at tidal gauge data as well as buoy data just to confirm these results. And as you can see, between 1998 and 2014, there were a number of days or times where temperatures are above 25 degrees during the summer months. But what was more interesting is that Nantucket Harbor is increasing its temperature through time. So rates have increased depending on whether or not you're looking at the gauge or a buoy, range from 0.0123 degrees Celsius per year up to 0.046 degrees Celsius per year. So that translates to 1.3 per century or 4.6 degrees Celsius per century, and that translates out to about 8 to 10 degrees. So for the last century, we've experienced about a 10-degree increase in the harbors, which is extremely substantial. So what happens to the beds? So we know that once the plants get exposed to high temperatures, their physiology changes. But the areas that are most vulnerable to these high temperature events are those plants that are located in the more shallow depths as well as the deeper depths. So in the more shallow depths, the plants are exposed to other stressors. So once you start exposing them to high temperatures, they can't handle both stressors, so they end up contracting in the shallow edge. And then in the deeper edge, the plants are light limited. So when you add light limitation and temperature stress, the plants can't handle that either, and so they end up contracting from the deep edge. It's usually the middle sections of the bed that can withstand the high temperature events. So what are we doing to help with these declines? We have been working on an eelgrass restoration for the last couple of years. Eelgrass restorations are not something that's new. They've been conducted since the 1930s, and what people do is they either use seeds or vegetative shoots, or they use a combination of both. We've had the same guidelines in place since the 1940s. They were developed here in Massachusetts by a wildlife biologist. And he was such a keen observer of eelgrass systems that we didn't really need to modify the techniques too much. So the first thing we generally do is identify and remove stressors, and that's what our eelgrass health assessment was. We wanted to know what all the stressors were in the system before going out and doing the restoration. The next thing you do is you select sites to work at. So even though a system may support eelgrass, it doesn't mean that every microhabitat is conducive for the establishment and growth. And then the next thing we do after that is we identify a donor population. We look for very specific characteristics, which I'll go through. And then the last thing we try to do is spread our risks. So rather than transplanting a half acre all in a few weeks, we try to do it over a few years in case there's any type of weather events that end up ripping up the shoots. So eelgrass restorations, of course, have a number of benefits. It increases the ecosystem services in your harbor. It also helps to facilitate natural recovery in areas that aren't receiving any seeds. And it helps to raise public awareness, which is very important because a lot of people don't know how important eelgrass is. But on the flip side, eelgrass restorations can be very expensive. They can range anywhere between $50,000 to $400,000 per acre. So it's much cheaper to try to protect rather than restore eelgrass. And success rates are very low. So usually restorations, you get between 10 to 50% success for any plants or seeds you put in. A lot of times people get no success whatsoever and they have to move to a new site. So here's a map showing you our two locations. We have one at Monomoy and the other one at Fifth Bend. In 2012, Monomoy had an abundance of eelgrass. However, there was a shoaling event between 2012 and 2013, which wiped out the population in that area. And it still had not recovered in 2017. And so that's why we selected that particular site. At Fifth Bend, there was also a population, as you see, that extended around the bend and along the shoreline. It disappeared sometime between 2012 and 2015. We're not exactly sure about when, but we decided this was another site to work on as well after taking some measurements there. And so in terms of donor sources, we've been using Hussey Shoal as our main source. We also use rack that we collect from the shoreline that comes up during storms. And so it's a good way to get those plants back into the ground. Usually we try to do as many donor sources as we can because that helps to build genetic diversity. And genetic diversity is tied to increased resiliency. And the more donor sources you use, it also lessens the impact on the donor bed. When we're looking for a bed itself, we try to identify a natural bed, not a restored bed. And we like it to be about an acre in size with more than 50% cover. Anything less than 50% cover, you may have an impact on it. We're using two types of transplanting methods. We're using vegetative shoots, and we're also seeding at our sites. Our vegetative shoots are being collected May through June, and then September through November, and they're transplanted. And as for seeding, reproductive shoots are harvested in June and early July, and they remain at the tanks over at the hatchery. And then the seeds are planted in October. At both of our sites, this is the design we're using. We have a half-acre plot, and we have 5 transect lines that are about 100 meters in each within the plot. And each year we plant 33 meters along each transect line. So in year 1, we transplanted 0 through 33. Year 2 is 33 through 66, and then the final year is 66 through 100. At Monomoy, this is a transplanting design that we've been using. So every meter gets about 10 clumps of shoots. We put 5 clumps on one side of the transect line and another 5 clumps on the other side. And each clump has approximately 5 shoots. So there's about 25,000 plants that are going into a site. At Monomoy, starting last year, we also added seeds along the transect lines. And at Fifth Bend, we have a similar design going on. This effort is being led by Noah Singer, who is a graduate student at BU and also works for the Land Council. And he's looking at how different combinations of vegetation as well as seeds influence transplant survival, but also influence recruitment of scallops into that area. So that'll be a very important study that comes out in the next year or two. For our restoration efforts, we've been trying to involve the community as much as we can, helping with harvesting, planting, as well as clipping our reproductives and putting out the seeds. This has had a lot of positive benefits to students and volunteers, as well as the project. For volunteers, we find that it promotes place and project-based learning. They get to meet and work with scientists. It helps them learn some of the management behind the science. They get to work with people that have similar interests, and they also get to connect with nature and the community. In terms for project benefits, it really helps to facilitate project activation. It's great when we can get 30 volunteers out into the field to help us harvest or transplant. That reduces the amount of labor incredibly for us. And so we really appreciate anybody that comes out and helps. We also really like that everybody's motivated and enthusiastic. A lot of people bring new capabilities and innovation, and it helps with cost sharing for this project as well. And it brings community recognition, and this is very important because this helps to build stewardship, and the more people that feel connected to the eelgrass bed, the more they're likely to support any type of initiatives to protect it into the future. So this was a Monomoy site in 2017, and this is what it looks like in 2023. We've had substantial infilling the last couple of years. We think that a lot of the success has also been due to the closure of the site. The site, you cannot boat in it and you can't shellfish, and I think this is great because the plants aren't ripped up and the seeds are given their time to establish themselves. At Fifth Bend, we only started that restoration in the fall. There was nothing there last fall, and as of the spring when we came back, we have a lot of little seedlings, and we also have a lot of vegetative shoots coming up. So this is going well as too. So what can you do to help this project besides help us with the restoration? There are a number of things. You can help to improve water quality by reducing nitrogen inputs. You can plant natives on your property rather than non-natives. They don't require as much fertilization. They also don't require to be watered as much. Try to reduce fertilizer as much as you can so it doesn't run into the water and get into the eelgrass beds and cause macroalgae blooms. Also, a lot of people don't think about this, but try to maintain your septic tanks if you have one on your property. Pump annually, inspect your tank every 2 to 4 years. If you're a boater, try to be responsible. A lot of people don't realize this, but don't anchor in an eelgrass bed. It takes approximately 100 years for a patch that's only a foot large to go to an acre. So even if you're ripping up 4 or 5 plants, that's significant. And try to obey no wake zones. Wakes create turbidity, and so the more turbidity that you have, that's the less light that's available for plants. And try also not to, or do not discharge any black or gray water. There are free services in town that can take both your black and gray water. And lastly, be responsible with waste. Try not to put anything down drains. Even if you're putting pesticides, herbicides, they all go into the water column, and that's bad for the plants. So I'm sure you're wondering what can be done about rising sea surface temperatures. There are a number of groups that are working right now trying to identify different types of techniques to help eelgrass beds. We've been talking about assisted migration for a few years now, where we take plants that are hardier, move them from the south to north. We're also talking about selective breeding, editing genes, working with microbiomes. So similar to people, eelgrass has a microbiome around its roots and rhizomes, and there are some bacteria that make plants more tolerant to higher temperatures. However, all of these methods are about 5 to 10 years away, and we need to act more immediately. And so the recommendation at the moment is to continue to reduce other threats to eelgrass. So just as I said before, try to improve water quality as well as clarity, because that's the best thing that you can do, and then the eelgrass can start to focus in on just one stressor rather than multiple stressors coming at it at once. So a couple of years ago, there was a paper that came out discussing what is needed for a resilient seagrass bed. And this is a general framework. As I keep on saying, you need to have an environment where you have good water quality. You have to have low algae cover. You really need to have a stable climate. And so try to support any policies that are beneficial for the climate. You also need to have a number of biological features, such as connected ecosystems. So don't just protect the eelgrass beds, also protect the salt marshes. Try to encourage trophic interactions. You need to have as many organisms, both carnivores as well as herbivores, in your systems. And then lastly, in terms of our eelgrass beds, we need to continue to maintain genetic diversity so the plants are resilient to future stressors. We need to make sure we have seed banks, and we need to make sure that the habitats are continuous and not fragmented. So just a quick summary of everything I discussed today. So I hope you all recognize how important eelgrass is now. It is declining here in Nantucket. We've lost about 34%. And our health assessments are showing that these losses are due to high levels of nutrients, light limitation, and thermal stress. And these are characteristics of cultural eutrophication as well as climate change. We're trying to help facilitate recovery with restorations, and we have 2 half-acre restorations going on, but that's not really enough. Everybody needs to support any types of management actions to help make a more resilient population that survives into the future. And that is it.
Thank you, Alyssa. I am really appreciative of the work that Alyssa has helped us to conduct on the eelgrass, because I think that just having this data is so important to confirm what many of us maybe would have suspected or supposed, but I think that it's very powerful to actually have the information to confirm that this is the case. And there are certainly a variety of stressors that are impacting our eelgrass and our environment, which is pretty typical. And I think that what the take-home message is, and I know that there's an element of doom and gloom in the story here, but I think what the take-home message is that we should feel empowered to be able to address what we have control over. And that does come back to our land use on island, what we do with our properties, how we landscape, how we manage our waste. We actually created a little take action card, which you'll find in your program on your chair, that outlines a lot of the points and actions that Alyssa covered in her talk. And we would just encourage everyone to take that home with you and take a look at it. We can certainly provide more. But I think the point is that there is work that we can do, and we are continuing to work with the town directly on how we can, from here, with a lot of this baseline information, move forward and continue to monitor our eelgrass in a way that helps us to show whether we're seeing improvements or not, how the source of nutrients in our eelgrass and our waters may be changing with response to regulation of fertilizer or changes in wastewater management. So the information is powerful for us, but we definitely all need to participate in the solution. So I would love to invite questions. I have Noah Singer, who also, when we're finished here, if you would like to participate in any of those really fun-looking photos of people planting eelgrass, Noah's your guy, and I know he could still use some help this summer, so feel free to chat with him. And then RJ Turcott, our Nantucket waterkeeper, is over there with a microphone. So I'm going to invite some questions, and then afterwards, before you get up to use your drink ticket, we have one more small update. So let's do some Q&A for Alyssa, and then we'll wrap up after that. Thank you.
Thank you. I notice on the Take Action brochure that you've mentioned fertilizer should be certified, but that the landscaper should obtain a fertilizer license. And they also reiterated that at last week's Water Coalition meeting. But do you have the same standards now for pesticide use on yards? Or do you have any idea about what number of properties are using pesticides and to what degree?
Alyssa probably cannot answer that question. I actually cannot directly answer that question. There's a state pesticide license requirement and not a local one. I think that Jeff Carlson is here from the Natural Resources Department. Jeff, I don't know if you want to add to that at all, but there's whether we know who's licensed to be using pesticides and herbicides.
Sure. So hello, everyone. Jeff Carlson, the Director of the Natural Resources Department. Just to get put on the spot for a quick question, but As far as pesticide licensing and herbicide licensing goes, it's a program that's exclusively run through the Commonwealth. So there's a state licensing procedure. Anyone who's commercially applying should be licensed through the state. There are reporting requirements back to them, and they do some very limited inspections. But again, if you're a property owner who's using a landscaper and you know they're applying that product, I think the question that should go back to them is, can I see your license before you start applying that product, and why are you choosing those to go down? Those are always important questions to ask. I think there's been some want to do, some sort of programming for pesticides and herbicides locally, but again, the state is very restrictive over pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers at this point.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Alyssa. Fantastic. I'm so pleased to see this work come to fruition. Land Council's done a great job in its partnership with BU. Just to follow up on the pesticide question, yes, I believe almost every lawn that is fertilized on Nantucket by a professional landscaper is treated with what's called weed and feed granular fertilizer. So it's a combination of fertilizer and pesticide. The tracking of that is certainly could be improved by the state and the town. But what really is of most concern is the fertilizer and the nutrients that are escaping that fertilizer that are not being uptaken by the plant, particularly the nitrogen. And we all hope that the town will continue to improve its certification program and its licensing program so that there are actually reporting requirements and a more robust certification license for our landscaping industry.
Hi, thanks, wonderful presentation. I'm just curious if you know of other communities that have launched eelgrass restoration elsewhere, maybe started earlier, or are we on the cutting edge? If there are other communities, what kind of success are they having?
So eelgrass restorations are conducted all over the East and West Coast. Seagrass restorations are conducted all over the world. So we're not necessarily on the cutting edge. We're just taking a framework that's been put in place in other locations and applying it here. The one thing that we're doing that's a little bit unique is that we're using a combination of vegetation and seeding. Usually down south they use seeds, and in the north they use vegetation. And north meaning like from Cape Cod north. But Nantucket is very unique in the sense that both seem to be working here. And so I'm very excited to be using both methods here. And so I think that's going to really help out success rates in the future.
Could you distinguish between seaweed and its benefits, if any, and eelgrass in swimming along the in the Nantucket Harbor between Grant Point and the jetties? There seems to be the darker seaweed growing. I haven't seen eelgrass there, but the water is very clear, and I think it's clearer than it's been in previous decades.
So algae takes up nutrients, so that it does provide a benefit. But if you have mat algae, which is what you're seeing here out in the harbor, then it just sits there. And so it takes up the nutrients, but then since it's not drifting out into the ocean, it starts to decay and degrade. And so what ends up happening is the nitrogen goes back into the system. And if you get too much algae, it also causes anoxia. And that's when you start getting the fish to die because they don't have enough oxygen. And so it really depends on where you are, the benefits of having a lot of macroalgae. But in this particular system, I don't see any benefit for the amounts that you have.
Crabs, to what extent To what extent are the invasive green crabs, I know they clip eelgrass when they're foraging, to what extent are they hurting our eelgrass growth?
RJ, did you want to, I can answer that, but I figured that since that's your study, you might want to say something.
Thanks, Alyssa.
I'm sorry, RJ.
So it's hard to quantify how much damage they're doing. We know the green crabs are doing really, really well anywhere there is eelgrass. That what you're referring to is bioturbation. They're ripping it out. Sometimes they're feeding on it. But the population studies that we have conducted don't give you an exact number of crabs in the population in either harbor. It's just about concentration and where they're feeding. So I think it would be more, it's more of a question of diminishing returns on how much we pursue European green crabs. We know they're doing damage, but of all the things Alyssa discussed in her presentation, trying to figure out if that's the number one issue, something we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah, I don't think here, so I also do restoration work up on the North Shore, and we see about 500 crabs in a trap in a 24-hour time period, and that's hyperabundant. And you know immediately when you put in eelgrass if crabs are an issue because they come in and they rip it up right away. And I think you do have green crab, like you do have green crabs here. They're probably a little bit more abundant than they should be, but you also have blue crabs, which help to maintain a balance in the ecosystem. And so the green crabs, blue crabs will predate on green crabs. And so they're just not the issue that we see up on the North Shore and in New Hampshire and further north.
And for context, I think our record as of right now is 82 crabs in a pot in Madaket in an overnight period, so not quite 500. So it's dense,
Yeah.
but it's not hyper dense.
Two questions, one hard, one easy. Could you please give us your assessment of the weight of the most impactful of these 10 or so factors? And the easy one is, how many degrees Fahrenheit is 28 Celsius?
So 28 is about 78 degrees. 79 could even run up to about 80 degrees. So that's very warm. Eelgrass usually, so I'll do this in Fahrenheit. Eelgrass usually likes to grow about 60 Fahrenheit. So when you're hitting 80, that's just too warm for them. At around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, that's when they start to go a little bit more dormant. They can't withstand freezing. And so there's that range that they like, but they don't like very cold waters and they don't like very warm waters. And then in terms of all the stressors, I think your nutrients are your biggest issue here by far. The nutrients, so I think nitrogen is your biggest bit. Yeah, I think if you reduce your nitrogen levels, you're going to see an explosion in the eelgrass population. I don't think we would need to do restoration. You would see less macroalgae. I think you would see overall a healthier ecosystem.
Hi, great talk. Has there been a comprehensive isotope study done in this harbor to determine where the nitrogen's coming from? Sewage, fertilizer, and naturally occurring, like swamps that are degrading and pumping nitrogen into the harbor?
So that's what we did, and I combined the sites for Nantucket Harbor, so you could see the range of values. There are some sites, so if you were to go out and look at, or if you were to break down my data, yes, you could say this site, the plants are getting more atmospheric deposition. This site over here, they're getting a little bit more fertilizer. But I combined everything because we talk about sample sizes, and I had, it's about 11 to 12 plants per site, and I wanted to combine everything to look at it so that you had like 100 points to look at rather than 11. You could do more sampling, but I think the storyline is going to be the same. You see fertilizer in Nantucket Harbor, and in Madaket Harbor, you see sewage and you see fertilizer. I don't know how many times you need to pull it apart to come up with the same story. So that's just, you could also look at algae if you wanted to confirm it, but the storyline I think is going to be the same.
Thank you, Alyssa, for coming and sharing this research with us. I think it's incredibly important for our community to be aware of. So you mentioned one of the ways that we could reduce the nitrogen outputs is to plant native plant species. Is there any particular resource you would recommend that we consult, a website, publication, app that suggests ideal native plants?
Thank you. That is a great question. And there has been quite a bit of work done by a number of the other conservation groups on island as well, the Conservation Foundation, through the Nantucket Biodiversity Initiative. I believe we actually have a stack of brochures out front on the native plants of Nantucket. And that is a really nice list of wildflowers, shrubs, trees that gives a whole bunch of different planting characteristics and needs. So take a look at that and feel free to reach out to any of the other conservation groups with additional questions.
That was actually the subject that I wanted to address, but I have a specific question, which is, are you aware of any incentives for people to convert lawns into natural flowers and grass meadows or whatever, on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm quite surprised sometimes when I go up harbor and see these verdant lawns which go right straight to the water. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of administrative remedy to limiting lawn size to X% of a lot size or something like that, and no closer than Y feet to the water, which could help to a certain extent, again, planting more natural species along the water's edge. And thanks to the Nantucket Land Council for sponsoring this.
Thank you for those points. They're all excellent and very, I think, important for the community to continue to consider. I know that there's currently some discussions around increasing buffer zones around our local wetland areas, and so continuing to support some of those initiatives. And there's definitely additional opportunity as a community for us to create some more policies, either through the fertilizer program that exists right now and the best management practices that we have for fertilizer use on Nantucket, and also I think through our local wetland regulations and even zoning bylaw as far as looking at how we're continuing to develop and use our properties. And the thing to really keep in mind, I mean, it's a balance, but everyone has their individual property rights, but we're all also contributing to this community resource. And so there also has to be an element of contribution and commitment to that as well. But thank you for raising those.
Really outstanding. I'm Peter Morrison with the Shellfish Association, also the Civic League. And I just wanted to make sure everyone had a broader perspective on all of this, which is we have a rather unusual partnership with a university and a research wing that's turning out graduate students who are eager to have topics for their master's theses and doctoral dissertations. And so I'm wondering, in your spare time, whether you are pursuing your agenda as an academic to have students be trained, and if you could just comment briefly on how this works, because it takes a lot more than just dollars, of which we are fortunate to have many devoted to this, to create this kind of partnership where we benefit from the research of eager young students who are drilling down into topics that really inform us as to how we should deal with these problems. So put your academic hat on and tell us in a minute or so how it works for you.
I like it, obviously. I'm here doing it. So getting restoration money from in lieu of fee and other organizations, you are just supposed to go in and put out a product of putting plants in the ground, and that's it. That's what the funders want to see. But I've developed these unique relationships with the Land Council where they give me the flexibility, like you were saying, to bring in some grad students to kind of play around a little bit, because there are questions that need to be answered. I just don't want to come into this site and say, okay, well, our funding agency wants us to put in 40,000 plants and walk away, right? Because that doesn't really help anybody. Every system is unique, and you need to learn that system. And so by having grad students like Noah, we're able to learn what's needed for Nantucket. And I do this as well in the Great Marsh on the North Shore, where I have students that just work in the Great Marsh, and they learn that system. And so they can adapt our management strategies and our restoration strategies so that it works for those particular towns. And so I kind of hope that, answers your question. But, I see, we had questions regarding which transplanting methods work best here. And so that was incorporated into a master's project. We also want to make sure that whatever we're putting in the ground is allowing scallops to recruit in, right? Because everybody cares about the scallops. And so that's why we're doing that experiment as well. Even in monitoring, I do experimentation. And so I like research and I like implementation. I'm a practitioner and I'm a researcher at the same time. And so it helps me, and hopefully it helps all of you as well by using this approach.
Thanks, Alyssa. And if I could just add to that briefly, one of the other, at least for me and for the Land Council, I think goals of this is to really look at what our best tools are moving into the future. There's a lot of uncertainty about how we're going to be able to manage our water quality and how things are going to change, how our eelgrass is going to respond to that. So if we can figure out what works here, as Alyssa's been saying, every system is different. If we can figure out what works best here, then the town, our other local organizations will have those tools and have that knowledge to be able to continue to put that into practice in the future as appropriate, depending on the scenarios we face going down the road. So it's about now, and it's about restoring these eelgrass beds and answering some questions, but it's also about building those tools for us to continue to use in the future. Maybe just one or two more? Sure.
Thank you for your contributions today. Question, can eelgrass be genetically modified to tolerate some of its stressors?
It should be able to, yes. So they're working on it. But like I said, all of that is about 5 years out. What we're doing more immediately is taking seeds from North Carolina and trying to bring them up here in the Cape Cod region. This project I have going on with the Park Service right now. Nantucket, I would not recommend that to happen at all. Nantucket and the vineyard are somewhat genetically isolated, and so I don't want to be bringing in anything from other locations into here. That could create a lot of issues, and so I'd like to try to make this system as resilient as possible by reducing the threats to eelgrass that we can control.
We'll just do one more for now.
Nantucket's landfill is very close to Long Pond, and Long Pond connects to Madaket Harbor through a couple of different bodies of water. Did you find any indication that pollutants, specifically from the landfill, are getting into Madaket Harbor?
I didn't look into that.
Emily?
We actually did a number of years ago. We were replicating some fish tissue sampling that the state had done specifically relative to mercury, and we were looking at a number of ponds on Nantucket, including Long Pond, where we caught a number of fish, some American eels, and the state accepted them and redid the tissue sampling. And because of the proximity to the landfill, we had the fish tissue. The state also agreed to test for an additional slew of contaminants that are typically associated with landfills, and they didn't get any high hits in those. We didn't specifically address any of those particular contaminants with eelgrass in this study as far out as Madaket Harbor. We really were just looking at the nutrients that Alyssa spoke of. So I'm sure we could all talk about eelgrass all evening. I want to just, before we wrap things up, as some of you may recall, last year for this forum, we had the town here to speak about the harbor plan update, and I've invited their consultant, Kim Starbuck from the Urban Harbors Institute, to just provide a little update to all of us on where that process is, the harbor plan update process. So she's just going to go through a few quick slides to let everybody know, and then she's going to be stationed at a table in the back close to the raw bar and drinks, where you can visit her and hopefully provide some information.
All right, thank you. And thanks everyone for having me. So as Emily noted, I am from the Urban Harbors Institute at UMass Boston. My name is Kim Starbuck. And we are right now working with the town of Nantucket, the Harbor Committee, and Woods Hole Group on updating the harbor plan. So first of all, what is a harbor plan and why develop one? So a harbor plan is basically a document. The 2009 plan that you guys have is a fairly dense document. It was about maybe 200 pages or so. It's a document that identifies the goals and the vision for your waterways and your shoreline. So really, we are pulling together what are the things that you want to see happening on your shoreline and in your harbors and putting that down on paper. Once we have an idea of your goals and your vision, we then develop strategies and identify resources that are needed to then achieve those goals and that vision. We address a wide range of topics, including eelgrass and nutrient loading, also boating, fishing, climate change. Climate change is going to be more focused on this year. We are looking back at your climate resiliency plan and trying to combine the two of those. And we also talk about public access. And then all of this will help inform the state with their decision-making regarding activities in the town. So you guys are going for a state-approved harbor plan, which means that then the state is going to look at this plan when they are looking to approve or not approve projects that are happening here and try and understand what Nantucket really wants to see happening on their shorelines. As you can see up here, the harbor planning area includes both Nantucket and Madaket harbors, and also goes out to Tuckernuck and Muskeget. And the harbor planning area was expanded a little bit from the 2009 plan to encompass a few areas with flooding and some other recommendations that the Harbor Committee provided us. All right, so the 2009 plan, that plan updated a 1993 harbor plan. And at Urban Harbors Institute, we actually worked with the town on that 2009 plan. And the plan had over 100 recommendations as to what they want to see happen in Nantucket and Madaket harbors. Those recommendations talked about water quality, natural resources, boating and navigation, public access, fishing, the commercial waterfront. There were a number of really great things that came out of that plan, including the shellfish management plan, the development of the harbor overlay district, some public access improvements. So a lot of really great things came out of that plan. And generally, we all look to Nantucket as kind of the gold standard for implementing your plan. There was really significant action taken on most of the recommendations in the plan. And right now, what we're doing is looking at what happened in the 2009 plan, what was done, what wasn't done, and what is still relevant for the future, and doing a little assessment of that. So right now, we are working on the plan update. The town did develop a harbor committee, which was created last year, and there are a number of harbor committee members here. If you want to just raise your hand. Sam is here. Oh, we got Peter Brace, Emily, Steve. Oh, Linda's here. Hi, Linda. So we have a number of the harbor committee members here. They've been really active and actually having us meet more than most other harbor committee members. And we're meeting once a month, twice a month to really go over what the town wants to see. So what we are looking to in terms of updating the 2009 plan is continuing to improve water quality and protect natural resources, ensuring equitable public access, fostering new and traditional uses of the harbor, restoring habitats, improving fisheries, and enhancing coastal resiliency. In terms of our timeline, so again, this whole process started last year. The circle is where we are now. The blue areas are areas for public input or public engagement. And so we already had one public meeting back in early June. I don't know if anyone was at that meeting. A few people? All right. Well, good news, everyone. There's going to be another public meeting this summer. So you did not miss the opportunity to participate. So that meeting will be held in August. We haven't picked a date yet, but you can get in touch with me in the back, provide your name and email, and you can be part of the email list, and then we will send an email once we have that date finalized. There also is a public survey which just opened last week. We already have a good number of responses, so that just shows how important the harbor is to all of you. And we really want anyone to participate in that and tell us what are your priorities for the harbor? What are some things you want to see happen? So we want as much feedback as possible. I'll provide a QR code to the survey in a minute, or also at the back table, you can come and scan the QR code and then participate in that online survey. We're looking for the draft plan to be released in winter of 2023, and then we will have another public meeting at that point to go over the draft plan and receive more comments. All right, next steps. Right now, we are having stakeholder meetings and focus group meetings where we are talking with really all of the stakeholders here on Nantucket about what issues they see happening in the harbor and how they want to improve upon those issues. We're also reviewing, you guys have a ton of documents already on water quality, on coastal resiliency, so we're reviewing those documents to make sure everything is cohesive. The online survey, as I mentioned, just opened, and then the public meeting in August. All right, so please stay engaged in our process. Really, we want to hear from you all as to what is important to make sure this plan really reflects the community. So you can contact us. So Jeff and Tara are here, I believe. So they are part of the town, and they are the ones that they're helping implement this whole process. Or you can contact me, which they might prefer that you guys contact me. We also have a website, which this QR code goes to our website, and you can take a look at the 2009 plan. And then we have an online survey. So I'll take a question or two, or if there's a question or two, I can take that now, or also I'll be back at the table if you want to come and talk to me and take our online survey. All right. Everybody wants to get to the bar, so. All right, well, thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, so I just wanted to thank everyone again for coming out this evening, and maybe you could just join me in thanking Alyssa again for her work and presentation. Thanks, everyone. Please enjoy the rest of the evening. I'm just going to actually throw up some images, some drone shots that we, thanks to some funding, have been collecting for the last couple of years of some different parts of Nantucket and Madaket harbors that you can watch cycle through as you're enjoying some conversation. So thanks again, and remember, we're all part of the solution. Thanks.